The checkpoint had been designed to intimidate. Rael could tell because everything about it was excessive. The towering obsidian pillars etched with bioluminescent glyphs, the guards in ceremonial armor that probably weighed more than a small vehicle, the scanners that swept over every visitor with a hum that resonated somewhere behind the molars. The Velthari did nothing quietly. Even their bureaucracy had dramatic lighting. Rael shifted the weight of his medical kit from one shoulder to the other and reminded himself that sweating was a normal human biological function and not, in fact, visible evidence of guilt. He was here on a coalition medical exchange visa, legitimate paperwork, legitimate purpose. The fact that he was also quietly terrified was simply a personal problem he would deal with later, preferably somewhere that had coffee. The guard nearest to him, 7 feet of silver-plated Velthari warrior with eyes like polished amber, held out one broad hand. Documents. Rael handed them over without a word. He had learned in his first 6 months working across coalition territories that silence was universally interpreted as confidence, whereas talking tended to reveal that he was, in fact, making things up as he went. The scanner swept him again. It paused at his hands. He knew it would. It always did. Human hands were, medically speaking, extraordinary instruments. 27 bones, 34 muscles, a nerve network so dense and precise that trained surgeons could detect a pulse variation of 3 beats per minute through fingertip pressure alone. Rael had spent 11 years developing his. He could identify 17 different tissue abnormalities by touch. He could set a fracture in near darkness. He had once repaired a severed arterial connection on a transport shuttle using a modified food sealant and the kind of focus that leaves a person shaking for approximately 4 hours afterward. The scanner apparently found all of this suspicious. A second guard approached, this one carrying a secondary device that looked considerably less friendly than the first. "Your hands," the first guard said. The language was Velthari common, clipped and precise. "Show them." Rael held them out, palms up. They were unremarkable to look at. A few old scars from surgical instruments, and one memorable incident involving a piece of alien flora that had very strong opinions about being examined. Institutional resistance rarely announced its retreat. It simply stopped showing up to fight and redirected its energy toward pretending it had never been particularly opposed to begin with. The palace medical authority submitted. "These are medical instruments," the second guard said, reading from the device display. "Registered as such. Class 7 biological tools under Coalition Medical Charter, Article 14. Rael nodded. "That's correct." The first guard looked at him for a long moment, with the expression of someone who found the entire concept of human biology faintly offensive. Then he handed back the documents and stepped aside. Rael walked into the Velthari capital city and allowed himself exactly 3 seconds of relief before getting back to the business of not looking like someone who was quietly changing everything. The city of Varath Solen was built vertically rather than horizontally, every structure climbing toward a sky that was perpetually amber, thanks to the atmospheric particulates of Velthari Prime's upper cloud layer. The architecture favored sharp angles and reflective surfaces that bounced light in patterns calculated to display the empire's prosperity to anyone looking upward from the lower districts. Rael had read the cultural briefing on the shuttle. He had also looked up at those gleaming towers from the lower checkpoint and thought that someone had clearly never considered what those angles looked like from street level in the rain. He had a room booked in the medical exchange quarter, a compact space shared with 2 other coalition physicians who had arrived the week before. Dr. Amara Voss from the Centauri stations, quiet and precise, who had barely looked up from her research terminal when he arrived. And Dr. Fenn, a Tilari whose species communicated partly through color shifts in their translucent skin, and who was currently cycling through shades of pale yellow that the cultural database indicated meant exhausted but functional. Same, Rael had thought, dropping his kit onto his cot. The medical exchange program had been running for 4 years, one of the few coalition initiatives that actually functioned as advertised. Velthari healers came to human and allied stations. Human and allied physicians came here. Knowledge moved in both directions. Mortality rates dropped. Everyone agreed it was an unqualified success, which in Rael's experience meant the political complications were simply well hidden. He spent his first day in orientation, which was mostly a series of Velthari administrative officials explaining regulations with the energy of people who found regulations genuinely exciting. He paid attention to the parts about restricted ward access and let his mind organize the rest of his actual priorities in the background. The actual reason he was here was a patient he had never met. He had received the case file 6 weeks ago, forwarded through channels that were technically within Coalition medical protocol, but had clearly been routed deliberately to reach him specifically. A female patient, identity protected under Royal Medical Privacy statutes, presenting with a progressive neural inflammation that Velthari physicians had been treating symptomatically for 2 years without identifying the source. The file noted that 3 different specialist teams had reviewed the case. It also noted, in careful bureaucratic language, that the patient's condition was deteriorating despite treatment. What the file had not said directly, but which Rael had understood from the pattern of its routing, from the specific symptoms documented, from the careful anonymization that was slightly too careful, was that the patient was important. His second day in Varath Solen, he was escorted to the restricted medical wing of the Velthari Palace complex and told to wait in an anteroom that was probably the size of his entire apartment back on Earth Station 4. He waited. The doors opened. A woman walked in surrounded by 4 guards and wearing the expression of someone who had stopped finding formal proceedings interesting approximately a decade ago. She was tall, even by Velthari standards, with the characteristic silver-threaded hair of the ruling bloodline, and eyes that were currently focused on him with an assessment so direct it felt almost physical. Behind her, an aide spoke quietly. Her royal presence, the sovereign of the Velthari reaches, Queen Seraphiel of the Eternal House. The Queen looked at Rael's hands, then she looked at his face. "Drop your weapon," she said. Her voice was low and absolutely certain, the tone of someone who had never once in their life issued an instruction they expected to be ignored. Rael looked down at his hands, then back up at her. "Your Majesty," he said carefully. "I'm a physician, I don't carry weapons." The Queen's eyes moved to his hands again, and something shifted in her expression. Not softened exactly, more like recalibrated, like a very precise instrument adjusting to new data. She said nothing for a long moment, then, "Sit down, human. Show me what those hands can actually do." And Rael, who had traveled 40 light-years to help a stranger, sat down in a palace anteroom under amber alien skies, and began the work that would, though he had no way of knowing it yet, dismantle an empire. The examination room they gave him was better equipped than he had expected. The Velthari medical technology was different from Coalition standard, more focused on energy-based diagnostics, less on the tactile assessment that human medicine had refined over centuries, but the fundamentals translated. A surface for the patient to sit on, instruments for measuring what the body was doing versus what it should be doing. Light that could be adjusted to reveal what normal light concealed. What it lacked, Rael noticed immediately, was warmth, not temperature. The room was climate-controlled to a perfectly comfortable level, but everything in it was designed for efficiency, for data collection, for the clean transaction of medical information moving from patient to physician. Nobody had considered that a person sitting in a clinical room, uncertain about their own body, might need the space to feel like something other than a problem being processed. He moved the primary diagnostic chair away from the center of the room and angled it toward the window instead. The aide who had been assigned to observe, a young Velthari official named Soren, who had the permanently startled expression of someone promoted too quickly, made a small sound of protest that he didn't quite complete. The Queen watched Rael move the chair without commenting. Then she sat in it, which he took as permission to continue. He started where he always started, not with instruments, with questions. Not the questions on the official intake form, which he had already read 3 times, and which told him the medical history, but nothing about the patient. Real questions, the kind that required a person to think about their own experience, rather than recite documented symptoms back at a physician who was half listening while entering data. "When does it get worse?" he asked. "Not what makes it worse. When?" The Queen was quiet for a moment, and he could see her actually considering it rather than defaulting to the answer she had given the previous specialist teams. "Mornings," she said finally, "before the formal sessions begin. And late evening, after the council meetings. Before performance and after it," Rael said, mostly to himself. She looked at him sharply. "That is not a medical observation." "It might be," he said. "Can I show you something?" He held out one hand, palm up, not reaching toward her, simply presenting, an offering of information rather than a demand for access. There was a difference, and in his experience, patients, all patients regardless of species, recognized it even when they couldn't articulate why. After a moment, she placed her hand in his. He worked slowly, the way he always did in a first examination with a new patient. The goal was not to extract data quickly. The goal was to build a map, a three-dimensional understanding of what was happening inside a body, built from pressure and temperature and the subtle resistance of tissue that was carrying more strain than it should be. His fingertips moved along the pressure points of her wrist, her palm, the junction where the Velthari nervous system had a secondary cluster that human anatomy didn't share, but that Rael had spent 8 months studying specifically because he knew he would be here. Soren shifted uncomfortably by the door. The Queen sat absolutely still, which told him something. Not that she was comfortable, that she was practiced at stillness as a form of control. "You have been told," Rael said quietly, "that the inflammation is the primary problem." She nodded once. "I don't think it is. I think the inflammation is a response." He turned her hand slightly, finding the specific point he was looking for, a density of tension along the secondary neural cluster that should have been soft, and was instead carrying the kind of sustained pressure that only built up over years. "Your nervous system has been in continuous high alert state for so long that the tissue itself has reorganized around it. The inflammation is your body trying to protect structures that have been under chronic stress." He paused. "How long have you been running at this pace?" The question landed differently than he intended. He could see it in the slight change in her breathing, the way her eyes moved away from his face for the first time since he had entered the room. She looked out the window at the amber sky over Varath Solen, and Rael had the distinct impression he was watching someone who had not been asked that particular question in a very long time. "I became sovereign at 19, she said. "I am 34. He did not say anything immediately. He let the number exist in the room without rushing past it. 15 years, she said, as if she were doing the calculation for herself rather than informing him. She brought her eyes back to his face. "Every Velthari specialist I have seen has told me the condition is manageable with the current treatment protocol." Rael kept his expression neutral. What he wanted to say was that manageable was the medical establishment's way of describing a situation they understood well enough to profit from, but not well enough to solve. What he said instead was, "Manageable and improving are different things. Have you been improving?" She did not answer, which was its own answer. He spent the next hour doing what the previous 3 specialist teams apparently had not done, which was examining her as a complete system rather than a collection of documented symptoms. The Velthari physiological structure was different from human in specific ways that mattered enormously once you understood the logic of the differences. Their secondary nervous system, the one the official medical literature called the resonance network, was far more integrated with emotional and cognitive processing than human neurology. What humans experienced as stress lived mostly in the body. What Velthari experienced as stress lived in the resonance network, which meant it was simultaneously more diffuse and more total. It also meant it was far more responsive to certain kinds of intervention that standard Velthari medicine, focused as it was on energy-based treatment, had never developed. Human hands, specifically, were almost uniquely suited to it. Rael explained this as he worked, not because he needed her to understand the mechanism, but because he had learned that patients who understood what was happening to them healed faster. Something about agency, about the difference between having things done to your body and participating in what your body was doing. The Queen listened without interrupting, which he appreciated. Some of his more difficult patients talked over explanations because silence felt like vulnerability. She seemed to have made a different calculation, that understanding something was worth the discomfort of not already knowing it. By the end of the hour, the tension in the secondary cluster had reduced measurably, not resolved. That would take time and consistency, and a treatment approach that was going to require some convincing of the Palace Medical Authority, but reduced enough that he could see it in the way she held her shoulders when she stood, slightly lower, slightly less like someone bracing for impact. She stood by the window looking out at the city below, and Rael packed his instruments and gave her the space to process whatever she was processing. "This treatment," she said finally, "you will need regular access to continue it." "Yes," he said. "The Palace Medical Authority will object. They have approved protocols." "I know," Rael said. "I've read them." She turned from the window. There was something different in her expression now. The assessment was still there, that direct evaluating quality that she seemed to carry the way other people carried a title. But there was something alongside it now that had not been present when she walked in. "You moved my chair," she said. Rael looked at the window-facing chair. "Yes. Why?" "Because you've spent 15 years sitting in rooms designed for other people's comfort," he said. It seemed like a small thing to change. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Soren by the door had quietly stopped breathing. Then the Queen said, "You will have full access. Whatever the medical authority objects to, I will manage." She paused. "The same way you apparently intend to manage everything else." Rael allowed himself a small smile. "I'm just a physician, Your Majesty." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family. "You moved my chair on the first day," she said. "Do not tell me what you are just." She walked toward the door, and her guards fell into formation around her with the practiced ease of long habit. At the threshold, she stopped without turning around. "Tomorrow," she said, "same time." It was not a question. Rael had not expected it to be. After she left, Soren exhaled slowly and looked at Rael with the expression of someone who had just watched a person walk up to a live electrical current and somehow not get electrocuted. "How did you know she would agree to continued sessions?" he asked. "Just like that." Rael looked at the chair still positioned toward the window. "I didn't," he said honestly. "I just started with what I could actually fix." The Palace Medical Authority objected on a Tuesday. Rael had been expecting it since approximately the second session, when he had arrived to find 3 senior Velthari physicians waiting in the anteroom, with the collective energy of people who had prepared speeches. They were not wrong to be concerned, technically speaking. He was an outsider working with their highest-profile patient, using methods that did not appear in any Velthari medical registry. From their perspective, the situation had the structure of a problem that needed to be contained before it became a larger problem. He listened to all 3 speeches without interrupting. This took considerable patience because the second physician repeated himself in a way that suggested he had written his objections down and then accidentally memorized them twice. When they finished, Rael asked a single question. "In 2 years of treatment under approved protocols," he said, "has her condition improved?" The silence that followed was the specific kind that contains an answer nobody wants to say out loud. He did not press the point. He had learned early in his career that winning arguments with institutional medicine was less useful than simply continuing to produce results, because results were harder to argue with than methodology. He thanked them for their time, walked past them into the examination room, and got back to work. By the 3rd week, the morning severity of the Queen's symptoms had reduced by measurable degrees. He knew because she told him, which was itself significant. The previous specialist teams had relied on instrument readings. Rael relied on those too, but he also asked directly and consistently how she felt, which was apparently a practice so uncommon in royal medical care that Soren had once quietly asked him if it was a human cultural custom. "It's just medicine," Rael had said. Soren had written something in his observation log, with the careful energy of a person documenting something they intended to think about later. The sessions had developed their own rhythm. Rael would arrive, adjust whatever in the room needed adjusting. He had by this point repositioned 4 pieces of furniture and replaced the overhead light calibration twice, and the Queen would arrive exactly on time with the punctuality of someone for whom lateness was a concept that applied to other people. She would sit, he would work, and somewhere in the middle of it, they would talk. It had started practically. He asked questions to build his understanding of her daily patterns, because chronic neural stress did not exist independently of daily life, and any treatment that ignored the context was treating symptoms rather than causes. She answered because she was, underneath the 15 years of sovereign stillness, someone who thought carefully about things and had limited opportunities to do so out loud, but practically had shifted into something else gradually enough that neither of them had marked the transition. She told him about the council sessions, not the political content but the physical experience of them, the specific exhaustion of performing certainty for hours at a time, the way she had trained herself to read a room through peripheral vision, because looking directly at council members during sensitive discussions gave away too much information about her own thinking. The headaches that followed formal addresses, not from the speaking itself but from the sustained vocal calibration required to project authority into a chamber designed to make the person at its center feel exposed. Rael listened and worked, and occasionally said things like, "That tracks physiologically," or "That explains the secondary cluster tension on Tuesdays," which made her stop mid-sentence the first time, because apparently nobody had ever responded to descriptions of her sovereign duties by explaining what they were doing to her nervous system in real time. "Is that useful to know?" he asked. She considered it. "Yes," she said. "Everything I have been told about my condition has been about managing it. Nobody has explained the mechanism. Understanding the mechanism gives you options," Rael said. "Right now you are reacting to symptoms. If you understand the cause, you can make different choices upstream." She was quiet for a moment. "The Velthari medical philosophy," she said slowly, "focuses on restoration, returning the body to its correct state." Rael kept his hands moving along the resonance network points, feeling the familiar geography of tension and release he had spent 3 weeks mapping. "Human medicine spent about 200 years focused on the same thing," he said. "Then we started asking why people kept needing to be restored to begin with. Turned out a lot of what we were treating was just the body keeping score." "Keeping score of what?" "Of everything it was asked to absorb without acknowledgement," he said. "Stress, grief, sustained performance, prolonged isolation. The body doesn't distinguish between types of burden. It just accumulates. The Queen's resonance network had a particular point along the left meridian, just below the secondary cluster, that held tension like a structural fault line. Rael had been working around it carefully for days, building the surrounding tissue's capacity before attempting direct work on the fault itself. Today it finally yielded under his hands, a slow release of held pressure that he could feel travel upward through the network like a long exhale. She made a small sound that she immediately controlled, but he had heard it. "That," he said quietly, "has been locked for a long time." She did not answer immediately. When she spoke, her voice had the quality of someone choosing words with unusual care. "My coronation physician told me that Velthari sovereigns carry the weight of their people in their bodies. That physical difficulty was evidence of dedication. That discomfort meant you were doing your duty." Rael said nothing for a moment, then, "Is that what you believe?" "I believed it for 12 years, she said. "It was a useful belief. It made the discomfort mean something. And now," he said, "now I am sitting in a repositioned chair, while a human physician explains that my nervous system has been treating my own life as a threat," she said. She paused. "I find I am revising several positions simultaneously." Rael smiled at the back of her head. "For what it's worth," he said, "the part about carrying your people is probably true. The part about that being healthy or sustainable is what needs revising." She turned then, which she did not usually do mid-session, and looked at him directly. He was close enough that he could see the specific quality of attention she was directing at him, the kind that meant something was being evaluated and was passing. "Why are you here?" she asked. "Not the official reason, the actual reason." Rael met her eyes. "Because the case file found me through channels that someone routed deliberately," he said. And because whoever did that understood that what you needed wasn't more energy treatment and approved protocols. It needed someone willing to start from the beginning and ask different questions. She held his gaze. And what have your different questions told you? That you have been running a civilization on a nervous system that has never once been allowed to fully rest, he said. That the people around you have been so focused on your function that they stopped considering your experience. And that you have been so focused on your function that you did the same thing to yourself. The amber light through the window caught the silver threading in her hair, and the room was very quiet. Those are significant conclusions for 3 weeks of sessions, she said. I have fast hands, Rael said. She made the sound again, the one that was adjacent to a laugh, and this time she did not control it fully. It changed her face completely, briefly, the sovereign stillness replaced by something that looked startlingly like relief. Then she straightened, and the stillness returned, but it sat differently now. Less like armor, more like a choice. The council has requested a formal review of your credentials and methodology, she said, returning to the practical with the ease of long practice. They will present it as a routine procedural matter. And what is it actually? Rael asked. A test, she said simply. They want to know if you are manageable. She paused. I am curious to see what you do with that. Rael began preparing to close the session, organizing his instruments with the methodical care that had become its own kind of ritual in this room. I'll probably move some furniture, he said. She stood and her guards positioned themselves, and the formal architecture of her role reassembled around her the way it always did at the end of their sessions, visibly and with a weight he could now recognize for exactly what it was. At the door she paused, and without turning said, The council meeting is Thursday. I will ensure you are informed of the outcome. She left. Soren remained for a moment, looking at Rael with the expression he had been developing over 3 weeks, the one that combined professional documentation instinct with something more personal. He had stopped writing in his observation log during the sessions approximately a week ago. He had not mentioned this, and Rael had not asked. For the record, Soren said quietly, the chair position is better. Toward the window. Rael looked at the chair. Yeah, he said. I thought so too. He packed the last of his instruments and stood in the empty room for a moment, feeling the particular quality of the silence a space holds after something has shifted inside it. Outside, Varath Solen climbed toward its amber sky, all sharp angles and reflected prosperity and architecture that had never once asked who it was built for. He thought about the fault line that had finally released. About 12 years of believing discomfort meant dedication. About a coronation physician telling a 19-year-old that pain was proof she was doing her job. He thought about his sister back on Earth Station 4, who had said something similar once about a different kind of weight she had carried for different reasons, and how long it had taken both of them to understand that endurance was not the same thing as health. Thursday, he thought. The council wanted to know if he was manageable. He picked up his kit and walked out into the amber-lit corridor, and decided the answer was going to be more interesting than they were expecting. The council review was held in a chamber that had been designed specifically to make people feel small. Rael recognized the architecture immediately because it followed a logic universal enough to cross species lines. High ceilings, elevated seating for the evaluators, a single standing position for the person being evaluated that placed them at the geometric center of everyone else's attention. It was the physical language of institutional authority, and it was fluent in every culture he had ever worked in. He stood in the center position and looked up at 11 Velthari council members arranged in a curved tier above him, and thought that the ceiling was genuinely impressive, even if the intent behind it was transparent. The council chair was an older Velthari official, with the silver hair of age rather than bloodline, and the expression of someone who had spent decades being the most important person in most rooms. He introduced the proceedings with the careful language of bureaucratic neutrality that meant the conclusion had already been reached, and the meeting was documentation rather than deliberation. They had prepared questions. Rael answered them. His credentials were legitimate. His methodology was documented in coalition medical literature. His treatment results for the first 3 weeks were measurable and positive. None of this was the actual point of the meeting, and everyone in the room understood that. The actual point arrived when the third council member leaned forward and said, with the pleasantness of someone who had practiced pleasantness as a weapon, that the council was naturally concerned about the sustained proximity between a foreign physician and the sovereign, that protocols existed for good reasons, that the palace medical authority had raised questions about the influence a practitioner might develop over a patient during extended treatment. Rael let the implications settle in the room without reacting to it. He had been in enough institutional reviews to know that the first response to a veiled accusation was the one that defined everything that followed. Defensiveness confirmed suspicion. Aggression confirmed threat. What unsettled institutional authority most reliably was simple, direct calm. He said, "The concern about practitioner influence over patients is legitimate, and I take it seriously, which is why my treatment approach is documented session by session, why an observer has been present at every appointment, and why I have submitted full methodology notes to the Palace Medical Registry after each visit." He paused. "If the council would like to review any specific session documentation, I can arrange access today." The third council member had not expected that. Rael could tell because the pleasantness flickered briefly into something less rehearsed. The council chair redirected. "The core question," he said, "was whether the current treatment approach served the sovereign's long-term interests, or whether it created dependencies that a more sustainable protocol could avoid." Rael looked at him directly. "What kind of dependency concerns you specifically?" The chair's expression sharpened slightly. "Dependency on a foreign practitioner whose presence here is temporary, whose methods are not reproducible by the palace medical staff, whose continued access requires ongoing authorization." "That is a fair concern," Rael said, and watched the chair recalibrate slightly at the agreement. "So let me address it directly. My treatment approach is not designed to require my permanent presence. Every technique I am using is documented and transferable. My intention from the beginning has been to train palace medical staff in resonance network assessment so that this treatment can continue without me." He let that land. "I submitted a formal training proposal to the Palace Medical Authority 8 days ago. I have not yet received a response." The silence in the tiered chamber had a specific quality now. Rael had learned to read institutional silences the way he read tissue, by what was being held and what was trying to release. The council chair looked to his left, where the senior Palace Medical Authority representative was sitting with the careful stillness of someone hoping not to be looked at directly. "The proposal," the chair said to him, "is under review." "It has been under review for 8 days, Rael said. "While the sovereign's treatment continues without the knowledge transfer component that would make it sustainable long-term." He kept his voice even. "I want to be clear about something. I am not here to make myself necessary. I am here to solve a problem. Those are different goals, and they produce different medicine." The chamber was quiet. He continued. "The resonance network dysfunction your sovereign has been managing for 2 years is treatable, not manageable, treatable. The distinction matters because manageable means she continues in the current state indefinitely, requiring ongoing intervention, which is a permanent dependency on medical treatment. Treatable means the underlying cause is addressed, the network restores functional baseline, and she requires significantly less intervention going forward." He looked at the council members in turn, slowly enough to be deliberate. "I would think a council concerned about foreign influence would prefer the outcome that reduces long-term medical dependency rather than the one that maintains it." The third council member's pleasantness had entirely evaporated. "What you are describing," he said, "would require access to information about the sovereign's condition that goes beyond standard medical scope. It requires understanding that her condition has a cause," Rael said, "and that the cause is related to sustained performance demands without adequate recovery. That is not a political statement, it is a physiological observation." He paused, "Though I understand it might be inconvenient if it turns out to be both." The chair called a 10-minute recess. Rael stood in the center of the room while the council members withdrew to a side chamber and the guards maintained their positions with the professional blankness of people paid not to have opinions. Soren, who had been seated in the observer position to Rael's right, leaned forward slightly. "You told them the cause of her condition is related to performance demands," Soren said quietly. Rael looked at him. "Is that inaccurate?" Soren was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "It's accurate." He paused. "It's also the first time anyone has said it in a room with council members present." "How long have you been her aide?" Rael asked. 6 years, Soren said. "Did you know?" Soren looked at his hands. "I knew she was tired," he said. "I thought that was just what the position required. I thought that was normal." Rael thought about the coronation physician, about useful beliefs, about the way institutions maintained themselves by making their costs seem like natural laws. "I think a lot of people knew and didn't have language for it," he said, "or didn't have a room where saying it out loud was possible." Soren nodded slowly. He looked like someone reorganizing something internal that had been in the wrong place for a long time. The council returned. The chair sat with the posture of someone who had been in argument and come out of it with a position he was not entirely comfortable with, but had been outvoted on. "The training proposal," he said, "will be approved with conditions. The methodology documentation will be submitted to the full medical registry. Continued treatment access will be granted for a period of 90 days, with formal review at 60. Rael nodded. "That's acceptable." The chair looked at him with the expression of someone not accustomed to having their decisions described as acceptable rather than received gratefully. Then he closed the session with the formal language appropriate to the occasion, and the council filed out with the collective energy of people who had not gotten what they came for and were still processing that. Soren walked with Rael back through the corridor toward the medical wing. The amber light was lower now, late afternoon pressing toward evening, and the reflective surfaces of the city outside the palace windows were catching it and throwing it in long diagonals across the floor. "They're going to keep looking for a reason," Soren said. "Probably," Rael agreed. "Does that concern you?" Rael considered it honestly. "It concerns me if it slows down the treatment. It doesn't concern me as a personal matter." Soren glanced at him. "Why not?" "Because I've been doing this long enough to know that institutions protect themselves by questioning the people trying to change things," Rael said. "That's not a conspiracy, it's just how systems work. The question is whether the work is worth doing regardless." He paused. "In this case, it clearly is." They reached the door of the medical wing and Soren stopped. There was something he was working up to saying, Rael could tell, the slight forward lean of someone whose thought had reached the edge of their comfort with speaking it. "She asked me once," Soren said finally, "about 3 years ago. She asked me if I thought she was getting better or just getting used to it." He stopped. "I told her I thought the treatment was working." He looked at Rael steadily. "I didn't actually know. I just didn't want to tell her I couldn't tell the difference." Rael held his gaze. "What would you tell her now?" Soren thought about it with the seriousness it deserved. "That she's getting better," he said. "Actually better. And that there's a difference and I can see it." Rael nodded. "Tell her that," he said. "Not as a report, just as a person who's been paying attention." He went inside and left Soren in the corridor with the amber light and the long diagonal shadows, and whatever he was going to do with the truth he had just decided to stop holding quietly to himself. The next morning's session was scheduled for the usual time. Rael arrived early and moved the light calibration again, and sat in the repositioned chair looking out at the city while the palace woke around him and thought about fault lines, and the patience required to work around them, and the specific moment when held tension finally decides it has been held long enough. Outside, Varath Solen climbed toward its amber sky, sharp and reflective and built to impress from a distance. He thought it might look entirely different from the inside once someone got around to changing the lighting. The 60-day review came and went without incident, which Rael had learned to recognize as its own kind of victory. Institutional resistance rarely announced its retreat. It simply stopped showing up to fight and redirected its energy toward pretending it had never been particularly opposed to begin with. The Palace Medical Authority submitted the Resonance Network training curriculum to the Coalition Medical Registry with their own seal of approval attached, as though the 8-day delay on his original proposal had been a clerical matter rather than a deliberate stall. He did not correct the record. Results had their own documentation. The training sessions with 3 palace physicians had been running for 4 weeks. They were careful, precise practitioners who had spent careers working within a system that had never asked them to think about the resonance network as anything other than a supplementary diagnostic point. Watching them encounter the methodology for the first time reminded Rael of something a mentor had told him early in his training, that the hardest thing to teach experienced physicians was not new techniques, but new questions. Techniques were learnable. Unlearning the assumption that you already knew what to ask required something closer to courage. All 3 of them had it, which mattered more than anything else. The Queen's condition had changed in ways that the instruments documented cleanly, and that Rael understood more completely than the numbers alone conveyed. The resonance network fault line he had spent the first weeks working around had not simply released, it had restructured. The tissue had rebuilt around a different baseline, one that was no longer organized around the anticipation of sustained threat. Her morning symptom severity had reduced to the point where she had, for the first time in 2 years, gone 4 consecutive days without the specific kind of headache that the palace medical records had simply labeled recurring and treated as a fixed feature of her physiology. She had mentioned this on the 43rd day, with the careful understatement of someone not yet willing to trust good news fully. 4 days, she had said, as though presenting data for his evaluation. He had said, "That's the network holding the new baseline. It should extend." She had looked at him with the particular quality of attention he had come to recognize as the moment before she said something she had been thinking about for longer than the conversation suggested. Then she had said, "You knew it would get here." "I knew it could," he said honestly. "There's a difference." She had been quiet for a moment. Then, "I have spent 15 years being told what my condition was, not what it could become." "That is unfortunately common," Rael said. "Medicine gets very comfortable describing the present state of things." "So does everything else," she said. He had not answered that because it was true in a way that extended well beyond the scope of a medical session, and they both understood that. And some truths were better left to breathe in a room rather than being immediately organized into conversation. On the 81st day, she told him about her parents. He had not asked. She had arrived for the session moving differently than usual, carrying something that was not in her posture exactly, but in the quality of the silence around her. The way certain patients arrived having made a decision in the corridor that they had not been aware of making. He had positioned the chair and adjusted the light and settled into the work without commenting on it. And somewhere in the middle of the session she had simply begun talking. She told it plainly, without the rhetorical architecture she used in formal settings. They had died when she was 19, the shuttle accident that the official record described, and that everyone at court understood was not an accident, and that nobody had ever said directly to her face, because she was the Queen, and the Queen could not be told things that complicated the narrative of stable succession. She had known within a week. She had performed grief at the state funeral with the precision of someone who understood that her actual grief was a political liability, and had no safe container in the world she had inherited. She had been performing it in installments ever since, she said, in small pieces in private, in the gaps between everything else. Rael kept working and let her talk, and did not fill any of the silences with anything except presence, which was sometimes the most technically demanding thing medicine asked of him, and the part that no instrument could measure. When she finished, the room held the particular quality of a space where something long compressed had finally been allowed to exist at full size. He finished the session without rushing it. He could feel the resonance network processing the shift in real time, the way the tissue responded to emotional release with the same physiological logic as physical tension yielding. The body did not distinguish, it just responded to the fact of being allowed to be honest about what it was carrying. On the 90-day mark, the formal review convened. It was considerably shorter than the first council meeting. The documentation spoke clearly enough that the proceedings had a different character, less interrogation, more accounting. The results were entered into the formal record. The treatment was reclassified from experimental foreign methodology to approved coalition-aligned protocol. The palace physicians were certified in resonance network assessment. The palace medical authority representative signed every document with the air of someone taking credit for a garden they had spent 3 months trying to have removed. Rael signed his own documents and did not say anything about the garden. After the formal proceedings closed and the council members filed out, the Queen remained. This was not standard. The guards looked at each other with the slight uncertainty of people whose choreography had not accounted for this variation. Soren, who had learned over 90 days to read the room with considerable accuracy, made a small gesture, and they stepped back to the perimeter. She stood at the window, the one that faced the city rather than the interior courtyard, looking out at Varath Solen in the late morning light. Rael stood beside her with the comfortable distance of people who had spent 90 days learning each other's silences. "You're scheduled to leave in 4 days," she said. "That's right," he said. "The palace physicians are capable of continuing the protocol." "They are," he said. "Dr. Vine in particular has exceptional instincts for the secondary meridian work." She nodded once. The city below moved in its usual patterns, transport vehicles tracing familiar routes, citizens going about the business of ordinary days inside the sharp, angular geometry of a capital built to project power outward rather than cultivate life inward. "When I was 19, she said, and the council was explaining to me how the sovereignty worked, one of the senior ministers told me that the role would require me to think of myself as a function rather than a person. That personal experience was a distraction from sovereign purpose." She paused. "I thought he was right for a very long time." Rael looked at the city. "What changed your mind?" he asked. She turned her head slightly toward him without fully turning. "A physician moved my chair," she said. He smiled at the window. "There's something I want to ask you," she said, "and I want you to answer as a physician first and then as yourself, because I think they might be different answers." Rael considered that. "All right." "As a physician," she said, "is the work here finished?" "As a physician," he said, "the acute treatment phase is complete. The network has established a new functional baseline. The palace team is trained and capable. There will be maintenance work, periodic assessment, adjustments as her schedule and demands shift seasonally. But the primary intervention is done." He paused. "That's the physician answer." She looked at him directly. "And the other answer?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the city that had been built to impress from a distance and that he had spent 90 days seeing from the inside. "No," he said. "I don't think it's finished. I think it's actually just becoming clear what it is." She held his gaze with the steadiness that was one of the things he had come to understand was not performed composure, but genuine quality. Something that had always been there under the armor the role required, waiting for conditions that made it safe to simply exist without justification. "The Coalition Medical Exchange Program," she said, "allows for extended placements. Up to 3 years for practitioners working on long-term treatment protocols requiring continuity of care." Rael looked at her. "I'm aware of that provision," he said. "The Palace Medical Authority," she said, with the faintest quality of something that in anyone else he would have called amusement, "has already submitted the paperwork." He laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that surprised him, that came from somewhere that had been quietly content for 90 days and had not announced itself until this moment. "You planned that before the review?" "I plan most things before the relevant meeting," she said. "I find it reduces uncertainty. And if I had said the work was finished—" She was quiet for a moment. "Then I would have respected that answer," she said. "And I would have been wrong about you, which would have been its own kind of information." Outside, the amber light moved across Varath Solen, and the sharp angles caught it, and for a moment the reflective surfaces threw it in every direction at once, brightness scattering across the city without pattern or hierarchy, landing equally on the high towers and the lower districts, and everything in between. Rael thought about his sister on Earth Station 4, who had once told him that the best thing about his work was that he always came back changed by it, in ways that were recognizably him, but more so. He thought about fault lines and what they became after they released. He thought about the difference between a system designed to manage and one genuinely trying to heal, and how the gap between those two intentions was where most of the important work actually happened. He thought about a chair moved toward a window on the first day of something neither of them had known yet how to name. "I'll need to send word back to my placement coordinator," he said. Soren, from his position by the perimeter, produced a communication tablet with the timing of someone who had been holding it ready. "The message is already drafted," he said. "I just need your authorization signature." Rael looked at Soren, who had the expression of a person who had spent 6 years watching and had decided somewhere in the last 90 days to start participating. Then he looked at the Queen, who was watching him with the directness that no longer felt like evaluation, and had not for some time. He took the tablet. He signed it. Outside the window, the city moved through its ordinary morning, carrying its history and its sharp angles and its amber light. And somewhere inside its geometry, in a room repositioned toward a view it had always had access to but never quite faced, something that had been managed for a very long time was finally, completely, beginning to heal. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. There are thousands of stories like this one waiting to be told. Subscribe to HFY Soundscape so you never miss the next one.